How much of a turning point do you think this is, events of the last 24 hours?
This is a turning point, no question about it. We're not just on the slide to war, but we're seeing a sea change in the arrangements, the security arrangements of Europe. That we've lived through a long period of peace in Europe where borders were relatively stable until just recently, when Russia invaded Georgia 12 years ago and then invaded the Crimea 8 years ago. And that is going to have long-term repercussions. As you've just said, Colin, we're going to see more troop deployments, probably on both sides. We're going to see quite significant trade disruption between Russia and the West. And we're probably going to see higher energy prices as well as a result. So, this what has happened in the last 2 or 3 days is going to mean, sadly, lots of lives lost in eastern Ukraine, but is going to undermine the security of all of us in Europe.
On those troop deployments, I mean, we assume at this stage that they're temporary deployments for our troops to be moved to those eastern NATO member states. My introduction there touched on this idea that there may be more permanent garrisoning of some of those bases close by the border. I know, people read last week we are now the third biggest spender on defence in the world. So there'll be some people who will say, we're spending quite enough, thank you very much, on defence right now. What do you say?
Well, we're not third. I don't think we are. I think we're fifth or sixth in terms of spending. But the country that's dramatically increased its defence expenditure is Russia. So clearly the previous sanctions that were applied haven't really deterred Putin from invading other countries. So far as the deployments are concerned, when you say they're recent, Colin, I sent troops to Estonia back in 2015. That's 7 years ago. We've had deployments in Estonia. I sent RAF Typhoons down to Romania. We've had Royal Navy ships in the Black Sea. So this isn't, new or sudden. We've been building up, actually, deployments on the eastern edge of NATO because that's what those members have been asking for. They feel very vulnerable now when they've seen what Russia has done in Georgia and the Ukraine, and they are members of NATO. We are obliged to help them where we can, and that is why you've now seen British troops in Estonia and more recently in Poland as well.
And yet we are ploughing ahead with reductions in cap badges and regiments, and there are those generals, I imagine you will have worked with some of them, who say there comes a point below which you cannot go, and they use this word mass, that you have to have a degree of mass, sheer numbers, if you are to be a serious player in conflicts like this.
Well, I agree with that. And NATO said that as a very minimum, countries that belong to NATO should be spending at least 2% of their GDP, of their national wealth on defence. And we meet that target, we're exceeding it. And our defence expenditure, as you yourself have just said, is going up again. But we need to spend, across the board, not just on numbers of soldiers. We need to spend to be able to resist cyber attacks. We need to spend on new aircraft. We've spent on 2 very large aircraft carriers, and we need to be able to deploy in all parts of Europe and all parts of the world. So, there's always an argument for more defence expenditure. But I think what's happened in the last few days shows that as well as fighting terrorism in the Middle East and sending an aircraft carrier to the Pacific, you've got to look after your own backyard as well. And what happens on the continent of Europe, in the end, affects us, as we know to our cost twice in the last century.
I suppose what was scratching away at the back of my head and what I was trying to weave into that introduction was, are we set to return potentially to those days of the 70s and 80s when you had the British Army on the Rhine? It was tens of thousands strong. There were people whose childhoods were spent growing up in Germany, Brits abroad, in substantial numbers. Whether we are beginning to see perhaps a shift in direction back to something more like that, as opposed to that fairly limited deployment, as you say, which you signed off back in 2015.
Yes, and NATO had been deployed much further afield. NATO had a mission out in Afghanistan and so on. Clearly now, members of NATO feel they need to protect, particularly their eastern, northeastern and southeastern borders. And that's why you've seen several thousand American troops going to reinforce Poland. And that's why we're making a commitment, as I understand it, to send more troops to Estonia and some more troops to Poland. And we need to do that. That is the point of NATO. It is a defensive organisation, and members who feel threatened are entitled under NATO to ask us to come to their help.
Defence, as we know, is an incredibly expensive insurance policy. It's a mischievous question, this, but it is a question that's prompted by a lot of the emails we see here. People saying, spend more on defence. Keeping the country safe, the defence of the realm is any government's top priority. Where's the money going to come from? Stop spending so much money on foreign aid to kleptocratic countries where the spending can't be controlled. Often it's good money after bad. Cut the foreign aid budget, spend it on our own defence. What do you say to people who argue that?
Well, government has cut foreign aid in the last couple of years and has gone away from the target of spending whatever it is, 0.7%. So there have been some cuts. And I think ministers are also trying to spend the aid better rather than hand it over to large world organisations to spend it on programmes that are, specifically dedicated to relieving poverty on the ground. But the two things in the end, Colin, are linked. If you don't deal with the breakdown of security in some African countries, you get mass migration to Europe, and there's a cost to that. If you don't deal with international terrorism in the Middle East, then that terrorism comes back and smacks you here in Europe. So there is a link between the amount you can spend overseas and the need to protect yourself at home.